today's video broadcast, I want to take a look at Matthew 6:22, where it says, "The eye is the lamp of the body. If your eyes are healthy, your whole body will be full of light." And so we're going to talk about what we focus on and how that will affect the course of our lives. And how do we have a healthy eye? How do we acquire a healthy eye? I venture to say a healthy eye will ultimately come from a healthy heart. And Jesus taught that the greatest struggle with sin first originates in the heart. And we'll take a look at Matthew 15 for a second to get an idea of what Jesus was teaching here. It's also found in Mark 7. Jesus taught this on several occasions, or it's recorded at least in several parts. Mark 7 and Matthew 15, but we're going to take a look at Matthew 15 real quick. Jesus said, "Are you still so dull?" Jesus asked them. Don't you see that whatever enters the mouth goes into the stomach and then comes out of the body? But the things that come from a person's mouth come from the heart, and these defile them. From out of the heart come evil thoughts, murder, adultery, sexual immorality, theft, false testimony, slander. These are what defile a person, but eating with unwashed hands does not defile them. We're going to take a look. Jesus taught in another place where he said it was Matthew 12:34 through 35. It says, "You brood of vipers, how can you who are evil say anything good? For the mouth speaks what the heart is full of, and a good man brings good things out of the good stored up in him, and an evil man brings evil things out of the evil stored up in him." So what we allow to be sown and grown in our hearts will affect the course of our lives. And what if our hearts already have junk in them, and that is trying to pull us away from God? Are we powerless as Christians to do anything about it? Well, we have the Holy Spirit, yet we can practically, let's look no further than Proverbs chapter 4:23 through 27. "Above all else, guard your heart, for everything you do flows out of it. Keep your mouth free from perversity. Keep corrupt talk far from your lips. Let your eyes gaze straight ahead. Fix your eyes directly on what's before you. Give careful thoughts to the path of your feet, and be steadfast in all your ways. Do not turn to the right or to the left. Keep your foot from evil." So, practically speaking, we can guard our thoughts. We cannot keep temptation from coming into our lives, but we can choose whether or not we're going to indulge that tempting thought that pops into our head. We can choose to throw it out immediately, or we can choose to think on it. And we can choose to guard our thinking and not let our heart be drawn to dwelling on whatever it may be tempting us into sin to do. And so we take a look at James. We'll see a very practical way that we can keep that from happening. We're going to turn to James 1, where it talks about that. It talks about the conception of sin and the birth of sin in the heart. It says, basically, when tempted, this is James 1:13 through 15. "When tempted, no one should say, 'God is tempting me,' for God cannot be tempted by evil, nor does he tempt anyone, but each person is tempted when they are dragged away by their own evil desire and enticed. After the desire is conceived, it gives birth to sin, and when it is full grown, sin gives birth to death." And so James is basically saying we have evil desires in our fallen heart, that we can choose whether we're going to follow those thoughts and think on those things. And the more we think on something evil or tempting, the more farther we'll be led into sin through it. Eventually it will become actions, and after actions gives birth to a lifestyle, and that lifestyle will give birth to death. And so we got to choose whether or not we're going to let our thoughts and our hearts lead us that way. It's true we cannot fully change our hearts, but we can choose whether or not we are going to follow the evil inclinations of our hearts. And we can do what David prayed: "Create in me a clean heart, O God, and renew in me a steadfast spirit." And so we all, even as born-again Christians, have a certain amount of evil that still tries to creep up into our hearts and get the better of us. And we can choose whether we're going to be led by our hearts, led by the fallen desires of the flesh, or whether we're going to be chose to be led by the Spirit of God. And the more we submit to being led by the Spirit of God, the more He will transform our life. A few examples. Okay, we can choose to guard our thinking and letting our hearts, by keeping our hearts from being drawn to dwelling on whatever it may be that's tempting us to sin. For example, worry. Let's take a look at a very common general one. Worry, we cannot totally avoid situations that will cause us to feel anxious. However, we can choose whether we mull over those worrisome thoughts. We can choose whether or not we start thinking on the what if this happens or what if that happens. Jesus taught we are only to concern ourselves with one moment at a time. In Matthew 6:33-34, but seek first His kingdom and His righteousness, and all these things will be given to you as well. Therefore, do not worry about tomorrow, for tomorrow will worry about itself. Each day has enough trouble of its own. And so by seeking God's will in the moment, we, for starters, occupy our minds with what is good. And there's a Proverbs 16:3 in the King James Version says, commit your work to the Lord and He will establish your thoughts. So often, sometimes the best way of guarding our thought lives is to commit what we do to the Lord and be proactive and start seeking to do God's will. When we're pouring ourselves into doing God's will in our work, that gives us less time to fill our minds with unproductive, unhelpful, unworthy things. And we let Him be responsible for worrying about what's in our future. We add hardship unnecessarily by worrying about future events that have not even happened. Back to the eye is the lamp of the body. The truth is the eye represents where we gaze or focus. Yet if our minds were like an eye, what we choose to focus our thoughts on will become what determines whether our eye becomes good and healthy or bad and corrupted. We all have days as believers. Our eyes get focused on the wrong thing. Our gaze gets in the wrong place, and it will either lead us into bad things and sin, or cause anxiety. Or we can choose to focus on what Colossians 3:1-3 says, since you have been raised with Christ, set your hearts on the things above, where Christ is seated at the right hand of God. Set your minds on the things above and not on earthly things, for you died, and your life is now hidden with Christ in God. The more we refuse to gaze on the wrong things with our mind and our thinking, the more transformed our minds will become. The amazing truth is that what we feed will determine often what we develop an appetite for. For example, eating too much junk food. The more junk food we eat, the more acquired taste for junk food we'll have oftentimes. And the more cravings we will often have. The more a person gains weight, it's actually said that the fat cells will create more chemicals, secreting chemicals to crave more fats, But the same true is if we cultivate healthy appetites for good food, we can acquire a taste for healthy eating over time. Challenge question. In what ways am I feeding on an unhealthy focus in my life? What do I struggle most to keep from focusing wrongly on? And last but not least, what am I going to do to better guard myself and not let myself be drawn to thinking the wrong things? Hope you found this inspiring. God bless.